My name's Darlene Applegate. I'm an associate professor of anthropology in the Department of Folk Studies and Anthropology, and I teach courses in archaeology and biological anthropology and cultural resource management. Well, when I was growing up in Ohio, we lived just a few blocks from the huge city cemetery, thousands of graves. And so it was just part of our extended neighborhood, part of our playground. But we loved making up stories about the people who lived in that graveyard. We just took it for granted. It was just there and part of our neighborhood. But it really did foretell a future interest of mine, which came to fruition. When I came to Western, I had the unique opportunity to take a cemetery workshop through Mammoth Cave National Park, and it was offered by Lynette Strandsted, who is one of the nationally recognized experts on cemetery restoration. And it was also co-taught by Dr. Phil DeBlasi, who is an archaeologist at the University of Louisville, who has been doing archaeological research on cemeteries for a long period of time. So that just lit my interest in graveyards. And it turns out that not long after taking that workshop, I was walking my dogs on the farm and noticed on the adjoining property, right across the property line, what looked to be a historic homestead, maybe an abandoned well from a homestead, which turned out to be not a homestead, but a family cemetery, which allowed me the opportunity to apply some of the information I'd learned in the workshop in documenting a cemetery. So in order to accomplish that task, I decided to create a course on graveyard archaeology where the students could help me document that initial cemetery. And since then, we've been working at cemeteries in counties in the surrounding area. So the class is called Graveyard Archaeology. It's taught in the summertime, so it's a summertime field course. It usually runs for 3 weeks, and we meet about 3/4 of a day on a daily basis. It's designed for people who have no background in archaeology or graveyards. So although it's a 400-level course, it is very accessible to people who don't have that kind of background, so you don't have to be an anthropology student to take it. It has no prerequisites. So we work to preserve and to document graveyards in the local area. The first thing that we typically are charged with is clearing them out. Usually these are abandoned graveyards that haven't been maintained. So the first task is to remove the weeds and other plants that have grown up, which invade very quickly after a cemetery is abandoned. And then we spend time mapping the grave markers that are visible on the surface. We do some non-destructive subsurface testing for buried markers. It's not uncommon for them to get knocked over and buried over time, so we do things like probing, just take a long, narrow iron rod and stick it in the ground along a regular interval to look for markers that are below the surface. We document cultural vegetation, which is significant for interpreting the ways people used that space in the past. We learn how to record a grave marker by using standardized forms to collect data on dimensions and the raw material type. Of course, transcribing the inscription, which is a major task. And then we do repair work. We don't do anything to repair the markers themselves because that really does require a lot of specialized training, which I do not have. But we do things like rewrite markers that have been knocked over again, or ones that are tilting one way or another. We'll level out the ground surface to make them more stable. We also will try to connect broken fragments with standing fragments so we can put them close to where they belong, even if we can't actually repair a broken marker. There's an incredible amount of cultural information locked up in a graveyard. The obvious types of information would be things like family relationships. Usually inscriptions will include references to relatedness. So you can learn a lot about who's related to whom by studying some of the inscriptions in graveyards, as well by where they're located in the graveyard, because it's not uncommon, especially for these rural family cemeteries, for multiple families to be interred in one graveyard and for the immediate family members to be grouped together in certain sections. So by careful mapping of grave markers, you can identify family groupings. One of the projects we've worked on in this region was in Simpson County. The class that I teach was profiled in a newspaper article, and soon after that was published, I received a phone call from a local individual who has a family cemetery on a property in Simpson County. The cemetery was in very bad condition. None of the grave markers were standing anymore, and almost all of them were broken and displaced, and a few of them were missing. They wanted some assistance in trying to figure out where the markers went and maybe to make some recommendations about how to preserve or to restore some of the broken and damaged ones. And they'd seen the article about our class in the paper and asked if we would be interested in assisting them. So one of my students who had taken that class was interested in doing a research project. And so I put her in contact with the family, and they made arrangements for her to do research there. And part of the project was just mapping the locations of the grave markers and finding out where the graves themselves were situated, since the markers weren't on the graves anymore. The other aspect of that project involved trying to re-erect the markers. Unfortunately, a lot of the markers were freestanding stones, which meant it was just a tall tabular piece of rock that was set directly in the ground, about at least a third below ground, in order to stabilize it. Well, if the marker is uprooted, there's no way to know where that came from. Later in time around here, people started putting smaller tablet-shaped markers into bases, square bases. Now, the bases rarely move. And if you can match up the size of the tablet with the slot in a base, you can figure out where that tablet went. Well, unfortunately, these were freestanding and didn't have tablets that we could match them up with. So there was, unfortunately, very little we could tell them about where the markers went and whose grave was whose. And I kind of made an offhand comment to the family, like, well, you know, the only way we're going to be able to figure this out is if we dig up the bodies and, you know, do a profile of the skeletal remains and match up the sex of the individual and the age at death with the age of the individual as based on the birth and death dates and, you know, the name on the marker. And I fully expected them to just say, oh, are you kidding? You know, we don't want to dig up any bodies. And I'll never forget that the one family member just looked at me without missing a beat, just said, I can't think of a finer thing to do, which was not what I was expecting them to say. And so we made arrangements to exhume individuals from a couple of the graves. The students in my Graveyard Archaeology class did the final excavation with hand tools to expose the actual grave itself once we got down through the shaft. And one of the grave shafts of the three we found was empty. And based on our archival research, we were able to link that grave with an individual who was later moved to another cemetery. The other two graves did have remains. One of them held some very fragmentary skeletal remains and some fragments of the casket in which that individual was buried. The casket was wooden, not unexpectedly for this time period. This is the 1800s. And some of the wood was preserved where copper tacks had been used to hold a coffin liner, a casket liner, cloth liner inside there. The rest of the casket was gone, but we do have some fragments of it in that respect. And then the fragmentary remains, they were a little bit hard to analyze because there wasn't a lot of the skeleton left, but based on a lot of the skull characteristics, we were able to determine it was a male individual. It was an older individual based on the loss of all the teeth and the closure of the sutures on the skull. And based on the placement, because the context is so important in archaeology, you know, where you find things is so critical. So our careful mapping of things and relationship to other graves in the graveyard suggested to us that this was the patriarch of the family. Next to that grave was another grave that we exhumed, and that one held an incredible surprise, completely unexpected. We found a metal casket in that grave. And that's very unusual because wood was the predominant material. In fact, in that time period, most people were getting caskets from their local cabinet makers. This was really before there was a really well-developed funerary industry. If you find a metal casket, that means that they were in connection with different commercial markets where they were able to get catalogs for related grave items and order things that would be shipped in. So we did not expect in this rural cemetery in the middle of nowhere in Simpson County that we would find this beautifully preserved metal casket. And it did preserve the individual inside pretty well. Unfortunately, the casket lid had collapsed. So the individual's remains, the skeletal remains, were in a space just a couple of inches tall. So she was pretty compressed in there and very fragmented. All the bones were broken. So they were still in place, but very badly fragmented. So we had to do some of our analysis before we even took the bones out of the casket. We did some of the bone measurements, lengths and widths and things that you can use to figure out the height of the individual and the sex of the individual. We took those measurements before we removed the bones. And then after removing the bones, we had to painstakingly work to reconstruct and glue, which, as you might imagine, took a lot of time. And once the bones were reconstructed, then we could do some additional analyses and collect additional data to learn a little bit more about that individual. And we did determine that it was a female. She was an older female and a very short in stature. And based on where she was buried and her age at the time of death, and this very fancy casket in which she was buried, we concluded that that was the matriarch of the family, and that her children and grandchildren felt so highly of, and regarded her so highly, that they spent the money during the Civil War. This was at the beginning of the Civil War. They spent the money to order this very fancy casket for her to be buried in. And not only did they bury her in this beautiful casket, but the wooden crate in which the casket was shipped was also buried. So they put her in the casket and the casket back into the shipping crate and buried the whole thing. The design was very elaborate. It wasn't just a metal box. It was elaborate in terms of the construction. It was multiple layers of flat steel that were soldered together in certain places, like in the corners. So it was interesting to learn about the construction of that casket. The lid to the casket had a viewing plate, which is a glass plate with a separate hinged lid that would allow you to open and close it if individuals wanted to see the deceased's face. And the metal portion of that had a really beautiful kind of Art Deco-ish looking motif crafted into the metalwork. So there were lots of elaborate decorations that adorned this casket, which indicate as well that they had to spend a good bit of money to purchase this for their mother and then have it shipped in. And if anyone is interested in learning about the class, you can visit our website for the department. It's www.wku.edu/FSA for Folk Studies and Anthropology, FSA. And you can see information about all our course listings, including that one. One other thing I would mention is that you do not have to be a WKU student to take the course. So if there's a community member who's out there interested in cemeteries, as I know there are lots of folks who are on cemetery preservation boards in different counties, if you'd like to enroll as a part-time, non-degree seeking student, you can take that course.